Welcome. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. Also, comment which video you found the scariest. Now lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. London was its usual clamorous self until the fog descended. It wasn't the typical London fog, the kind that clung low to the ground and made coachmen curse. This was different. It arrived like a silent white tide, surging through the narrow streets and swallowing everything whole. One moment, the familiar tapestry of brick buildings and bustling thoroughfares was there. The next, only a dense, swirling whiteness remained. It began on a Tuesday, I recall. The morning had dawned clear, but by midday a peculiar luminescence had begun to emanate from the eastern horizon. It wasn't sunlight. It was a pale, milky glow that seemed to solidify as it advanced. Soon the first tendrils of mist crept into the alleys, tendrils that grew thicker and wider with alarming speed. By nightfall, the entire city seemed to be enveloped in it. Whispers circulated, of course. Fear, like the fog itself, permeated the city. People spoke of an unnatural stillness within the mist, a silence that swallowed even the usual nighttime sounds of the city. Then came the disappearances. A baker on Fleet Street, his shop still warm, his flour-dusted apron lying on the counter. A family of 5 in Spitalfields, their supper laid out on the table, the fire in the hearth still burning low. Gone, vanished without a trace. The watchmen, initially bold, soon became hesitant to venture into the fog. Those few who did return spoke in hushed tones of disorienting silence and an all-consuming white void. They mentioned faint cries carried on the still air, brief and desperate, followed by the distinct sound of hurried steps fading into the nothingness, but they found nothing, no bodies, no signs of struggle, just the impenetrable mist. Driven by a morbid curiosity, perhaps, or a foolish sense of bravery, I decided to see for myself. One evening, as the fog continued its relentless grip on the city, I ventured out. The moment I stepped off the familiar cobblestones and into the swirling whiteness, a profound sense of isolation descended. The sounds of the city, the distant rumble of wheels, the cries of street vendors were abruptly cut off, replaced by an absolute, unnerving quiet. Visibility was near zero. I could barely see my own outstretched hand. The fog had a strange texture, almost like a damp cloth pressed against my skin. It felt substantial. I moved forward cautiously, my hand trailing along the cold brick of buildings, trying to maintain some sense of direction. The silence was the most disturbing aspect. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was an active silencing, as if the fog itself were absorbing all vibrations. My own footsteps made no sound on the damp ground. It was as if I were walking on air. After what felt like an eternity, I thought I perceived something ahead. A faint, indistinct shape began to coalesce in the swirling mist. I moved towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drew nearer, the shape resolved itself into a doorway, slightly ajar. It was the entrance to a familiar alleyway, one I had traversed countless times, but now, shrouded in the fog, it seemed alien, ominous. Hesitantly, I pushed the door open further and stepped inside. The fog here seemed even denser, if that were possible. The air was cold, biting, despite the lack of wind. I continued down the alley, the buildings on either side looming like ghostly sentinels in the white void. Then I perceived it, a sound, faint, distant, but undeniably there. It was a scraping sound, like something being dragged across stone. It seemed to emanate from further down the alley. I paused, straining my ears, trying to discern its source. The scraping continued, irregular and unsettling. I began to move towards the sound, my pace quickening. The alley seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the fog obscuring any discernible landmarks. The scraping grew slightly more distinct as I advanced, interspersed now with a faint rhythmic thudding. The alleyway opened into a small, enclosed courtyard. In the center of the courtyard, I could just make out a shape in the fog. It was hunched over, and the scraping sound seemed to be coming from it. The thudding continued, a dull, sickening beat. I approached cautiously, my breath catching in my throat. As I drew nearer, the shape began to resolve itself. It was a figure, humanoid in form, but distorted, hunched at an impossible angle. It seemed to be dragging something across the cobblestones. The fog swirled around the figure, obscuring details, but I could see enough to feel a cold dread grip my heart. The thudding sound was coming from within the figure itself. Suddenly the figure turned. I could not see its face clearly through the fog, but I could sense its gaze fixed upon me. A wave of icy terror washed over me, paralyzing me in place. The scraping stopped. The thudding continued, its beat growing faster, more frantic. The figure began to move towards me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My legs felt like lead, refusing to obey my commands. The figure continued its advance, its distorted form growing larger in the swirling mist. Then, just as it reached me, everything went black. I woke sometime later, lying on the cobblestones. The fog was still there, just as thick and impenetrable as before. The courtyard was empty. The figure was gone. The scraping had ceased. The thudding was no more. I stumbled to my feet, my body trembling uncontrollably. I had no idea how long I had been unconscious. The silence in the fog was even more profound now, if that were conceivable. I turned and fled, retracing my steps through the white void, desperate to escape the suffocating embrace of the mist. I stumbled blindly through the alleys, my only guide the faint memory of the path I had taken. Eventually I emerged back onto the familiar street, the fog here slightly less dense. The gas lamps flickered weakly, casting anemic pools of light in the swirling whiteness. I rushed back to my lodgings, my mind reeling from what I had experienced. I bolted the door and collapsed onto my bed, my body racked with shivers. The fog remained for days, an oppressive blanket smothering the city. The disappearances continued. The silence within the mist became a thing of legend, a terrifying void that swallowed people whole. Then, one morning, it was gone. Just as suddenly as it had arrived, the fog lifted, revealing a city scarred by loss and fear. Entire streets were deserted, houses stood empty, meals remained unfinished on tables. The authorities investigated, of course, but they found nothing. No explanations, no bodies, no clues. The vanished were simply gone, as if they had never existed. Life in London eventually resumed, but the memory of the fog of 1764 remained, a chilling tale whispered in hushed tones. People avoided certain alleyways, and an unspoken fear lingered in the air. As for me, I never spoke of what I encountered in the fog. Who would believe me? And even now, years later, the memory of that hunched figure in the courtyard, the scraping sound, the sickening thudding, remains vivid in my mind. Sometimes in the dead of night, when the wind howls through the streets, I think I can still perceive that distant scraping, a faint, unsettling reminder of what lies hidden within the white void. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that whatever it was, it is still out there, somewhere in the forgotten corners of this ancient city. Fleet Street, usually a vibrant artery of London, had become a place of hushed whispers and fearful glances. A creature of nightmare stalked its cobbled lanes, a spectral hound of deepest black, its arrival always preceding an atrocity. The dog appeared as an omen, a phantom harbinger of carnage. Its coat seemed to absorb all light, rendering it a void against the gaslit streets. Its eyes, when glimpsed, were said to glow with an inner malevolence. The aftermath of its appearances was always the same, a body discovered, ripped asunder with a ferocity that defied human strength. Limbs were torn from torsos, flesh shredded, and vital organs exposed with savage precision. The wounds were not those inflicted by knife or blade. They were ragged, as if wrought by immense claws and teeth. A primal terror gripped the inhabitants of Fleet Street. Doors were bolted early, and few dared to venture out after dusk. A group of us, tradesmen and labourers, men hardened by the realities of 18th-century London, decided we had endured enough. Fear was a contagion, and we resolved to excise its source. We gathered in the dimly lit back room of the Cock and Lion, the stench of stale ale and pipe smoke, doing little to dispel the grim determination in our eyes. We spoke in low tones, our voices tight with apprehension, of the beast that plagued our streets. We agreed that something had to be done. We would hunt it down, capture it, and put an end to the terror. Armed with cudgels, lanterns, and a shared sense of desperate courage, we set out into the night. The streets were deserted, the silence broken only by the distant tolling of a church bell and the frantic thumping of our own hearts. The fog, a perpetual shroud of London, seemed denser than usual, clinging to the ground and obscuring the already limited visibility. We moved cautiously, our lanterns cutting feeble swaths through the gloom. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a shutter sent a jolt of adrenaline through us. The air was still, expectant, as if the very city held its breath. We searched alleyways, peered into darkened doorways, our eyes straining for any sign of the spectral dog. Hours passed without a sighting. Doubt began to creep into our resolve. Perhaps it was just a story, a product of fear-addled minds. But then a low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very bones, echoed from a nearby alley. It was not the growl of an ordinary dog. It possessed a deeper, more resonant quality, a sound that spoke of ancient malice. We exchanged nervous glances and cautiously approached the alley's entrance. The darkness within seemed absolute, swallowing the light from our lanterns. We hesitated for a moment, the primal instinct to flee warring with our determination. Then one of our group, a burly butcher named Thomas, stepped forward, his cudgel held high. We followed. The alley was narrow and winding, the walls damp and slick with grime. The growling intensified as we moved deeper into the darkness. Then a pair of luminous eyes appeared at the far end of the alley, burning with an eerie intensity, the spectral dog. It was larger than any dog I had ever encountered, its form indistinct in the gloom, yet radiating a palpable aura of menace. It stood silently for a moment, its glowing eyes fixed upon us. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it lunged. Panic erupted. We scattered, our carefully laid plans dissolving into chaos. The dog moved with an impossible swiftness, a blur of black against the darkness. I scrambled back towards the alley entrance, my heart pounding in my ears. I glanced back and glimpsed a horrifying scene. Thomas, his face contorted in an expression of pure terror, was grappling with the beast. The dog's teeth, long and sharp, gleamed in the lantern light as it tore at his throat. A sickening sound, a wet tearing, filled the air. I turned and fled, my legs pumping furiously. The sounds of the carnage behind me spurred me onward. I could feel the dog's presence, a cold dread that prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. It was pursuing me. I burst out of the alley and onto the deserted street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I risked another glance back. The spectral dog was there, its form now clearer in the dim light. Its eyes burned with an unholy fire, and its teeth were stained crimson. I ran blindly, desperately through the fog-shrouded streets. The sounds of pursuit were relentless, the phantom footfalls echoing behind me. I could feel its presence gaining on me, a cold, suffocating terror that threatened to overwhelm me. I stumbled, falling to the cobblestones. I scrambled to my feet, my hands raw and bleeding. I looked back. The dog was almost upon me. Its jaws were open, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But the attack never came. Instead, a chilling growl, closer than before, vibrated in the air. I opened my eyes. The dog was there, its massive head inches from mine, its hot breath reeking of blood and something else, something ancient and foul. It did not bite, it simply stared at me, its luminous eyes burning into my soul. In that moment I understood. It wasn't just hunting us, it was something else, something far more terrifying. Then with a final, chilling snarl, it turned and vanished into the fog, leaving me alone in the deserted street, trembling and soaked in a cold sweat. I never saw the spectral dog again. But the memory of its glowing eyes and the horrifying sounds from that alleyway haunt my every waking moment. The other men who had joined our ill-fated hunt were discovered days later, their bodies scattered throughout the streets of Fleet Street. Each face was frozen in a silent scream, their throats ripped apart as if by the claws of some unholy beast. I survived, but I'm forever changed. I walk the streets of London with a constant sense of dread, always looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those burning eyes in the darkness. I know it is still out there, somewhere in the fog-shrouded alleys, a spectral harbinger of death, and I can't shake the feeling that our encounter that night was not the end, but merely a prelude to something far more terrible. The fog had descended upon London, a damp, swirling shroud that swallowed the familiar sounds of the city. Amidst this gloom, a new figure appeared on the streets, a man with a weathered face and a curious contraption, a barrel organ adorned with grotesque carvings. He would set up his instrument on street corners, particularly near the poorer districts where children often played, and begin to crank the handle. The melody that emanated from the organ was unlike anything I had ever encountered. It was a haunting tune, melancholic yet strangely alluring, a series of notes that seemed to weave their way into the very fabric of the fog. Children, drawn by its peculiar charm, would gather around the performer, their eyes wide with fascination. They would follow him as he moved from street to street, their small figures disappearing into the swirling mist behind him, like moths drawn to a flickering flame. Soon, whispers began to circulate among the adults. Those who had been unfortunate enough to catch fragments of the barrel organ's melody complained of vivid, unsettling dreams that plagued their sleep. Images of twisted figures and shadowy landscapes would dance behind their eyelids, leaving them with a lingering sense of dread upon waking. Then came the disappearances. One by one, children vanished from their homes, their beds found empty in the morning. The only connection seemed to be their fascination with the barrel organ player and the haunting tune he played. Panic began to grip the community, mothers clutching their children tightly, their eyes scanning the fog-laden streets with fear. One of the missing children was my own. Little Thomas, with his bright eyes and infectious laughter, had been captivated by the music. I remembered him tugging at my sleeve, begging to follow the man with the strange instrument. I had relented just for a moment, and that moment had cost me everything. Days turned into weeks, and the fog remained, a constant reminder of our loss. Despair gnawed at me, a relentless ache that consumed my every waking thought. I would wander the streets, searching in vain for any trace of Thomas, my heart heavy with grief. One evening, driven to the brink of madness by sorrow and a desperate need for answers, I encountered the barrel organ player in a deserted alleyway. The fog swirled around him, giving him an almost spectral appearance. The haunting melody drifted from his instrument, its notes seeming to mock my anguish. A surge of rage, raw and untamed, erupted within me. I lunged at the organ, my bare hands grasping at the carved wood. I heaved it from its stand and brought it crashing down onto the cobblestones again and again until the instrument lay in splintered fragments. As the dust settled and the echoes of the destruction faded, I knelt amidst the wreckage, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands were bruised and bleeding, but a strange sense of grim satisfaction washed over me. I had silenced the music. Then my gaze fell upon a section of the broken organ. Embedded within the splintered wood, glinting in the dim light, were dozens of small white objects. I reached out a trembling hand and picked one up. It was a tooth, a child's tooth. I examined the wreckage more closely. Everywhere I looked amongst the shards of wood and twisted metal were more teeth, dozens of them, small milk teeth, each one a tiny, horrifying testament to a lost child. My blood ran cold as the realization dawned. The barrel organ was not just playing a haunting melody, it was filled with the remains of the children it had lured away. A chilling wind seemed to whisper through the alleyway, carrying with it the faint echo of the haunting tune. The fog swirled, obscuring the broken remnants of the organ and the horrifying discovery I had made. The barrel organ player was gone, vanished into the mist as silently as he had appeared. But the teeth remained, a silent, gruesome reminder of the children who had followed the music and never returned. And somewhere out there in the fog-shrouded streets, the melody might begin again. The late hour found me still at my workbench, the only illumination in my small shop the flickering glow of a single tallow candle. The streets outside were quiet, the usual nighttime clamour of London having subsided into a stillness punctuated only by the occasional creak of a passing carriage. I was nearing the completion of a pair of riding boots, the supple leather yielding to my practised hands. A sharp rap at the door startled me. It was an unusual hour for visitors. I cautiously unlatched the bolt and peered out into the gloom. A figure stood on my doorstep, tall and cloaked, the hood pulled up to obscure their face. They remained silent, their presence radiating a peculiar stillness. With a hesitant gesture, I invited them inside. The figure stepped into my shop, their form draped in shadow. They moved with a quiet grace, their boots making no sound on the wooden floor. Without a word, the hooded man produced a piece of parchment upon which was sketched a detailed design for a pair of boots. They were simple in style, yet the specifications were precise, noting the exact type of leather, the number of stitches per inch, and the height of the heel. The man pointed to the sketch, then to a roll of fine black leather I had recently acquired. He then placed a small pouch of coins on my workbench, the clinking sound the only indication of his communication. The sum was generous, more than I would typically charge for such a commission. He then gestured towards the boots I was currently working on, as if to indicate a desired level of craftsmanship. Throughout this silent transaction, the hooded man remained still, his presence strangely intense despite his lack of interaction. His hidden gaze seemed to pierce through me, creating a sensation of profound discomfort. I nodded, indicating my understanding of the order. The hooded figure gave a slight inclination of their head, then turned and departed as silently as they had arrived, disappearing into the night fog that clung to the streets. I examined the sketch carefully, noting the intricate details. It was an unusual commission, but the generous payment was welcome. I set aside the half-finished riding boots and began to work on the new order, the image of the silent, hooded man lingering in my mind. Days turned into nights as I meticulously crafted the boots. I selected the finest black leather, cut the pieces with precision, and stitched them together with care, adhering strictly to the specifications in the sketch. The work was demanding, requiring long hours by the dim light of my candle, but I took pride in my craft. Finally, the boots were complete. They were a handsome pair, sturdy and well-made, exactly as the hooded man had envisioned. I placed them on my workbench, admiring my handiwork. As I turned them over to inspect the soles, I noticed something deeply unsettling. The leather was scuffed and worn, as if the boots had already travelled a great distance. There were faint lines etched into the soles, suggesting they had walked hundreds, perhaps even thousands of miles over rough terrain. This was impossible. They had just been finished. The leather for the soles was brand new, showing no signs of previous use. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I examined them again, my mind struggling to reconcile the pristine condition of the uppers with the inexplicably worn soles. It was as if these boots had already lived a life before they were even completed. I wrapped the boots carefully, placing them in a sturdy box, ready for the hooded man to collect. I left them by the door, expecting him to return that night, but the night passed, and he did not appear. The next morning, as I opened the door to begin my day, I found a package waiting on my doorstep. It was a pair of boots, identical in every detail to the ones I had just finished. The same fine black leather, the same precise stitching, the same height of the heel. I picked them up, a growing sense of dread washing over me. These boots, too, had the same inexplicably worn soles, the same faint lines etched into the leather. Then I noticed something else. Stitched into the side of one of the boots in the fine silver thread was a name. My name. My room in the boarding house was on the ground floor, a small, sparsely furnished space that offered little comfort but was all I could afford. From the moment I moved in, a peculiar sound permeated the floorboards beneath me every night. It was a dragging sound, a scraping, shuffling noise that began around midnight and continued intermittently until the early hours of the morning. I assumed it was the landlady, Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman with a perpetual air of weariness. I imagined her pacing in the basement below, perhaps troubled by aches or anxieties that kept her from sleep. The building was old, its timbers groaning with age, so the sound travelled easily through the floor. It was an annoyance, certainly, but I attributed it to the quirks of an aging house and a restless occupant. Weeks turned into months, and the nightly dragging persisted. I grew accustomed to it, the sound becoming a morbid sort of lullaby that accompanied my fitful sleep. I would sometimes find myself anticipating its arrival, the scraping a familiar presence in the otherwise quiet nights. One afternoon, while assisting Mrs. Gable with some repairs to a leaky roof, I mentioned the nightly pacing in the basement, expressing concern for her well-being. Her reaction was peculiar. Her brow furrowed and a look of confusion, almost alarm, flickered across her wrinkled face. She informed me in a hushed tone that there was no basement beneath the ground floor of the boarding house. The building rested directly on the earth, she explained, its foundations shallow and simple. There had never been a subterranean level. Her words struck me like a physical blow. If there was no basement, then what was causing the dragging sound beneath my room every night? A cold dread began to seep into my consciousness, replacing the mild annoyance I had previously felt. I spent the next few nights listening with a newfound intensity, my senses heightened by a growing apprehension. The scraping sound was the same as before, but now it carried a different connotation. It was no longer the pacing of an old woman, it was something else, something unknown. The sound seemed to originate from directly beneath my bed, a specific area of the floorboards that always felt slightly colder to the touch. Sleep became a distant luxury, replaced by a gnawing anxiety and a morbid fascination with the nightly occurrence. Driven by a need to understand, to find a rational explanation for the irrational, I decided to investigate. I waited until the following afternoon when Mrs. Gable was out visiting a relative. With trembling hands, I retrieved a crowbar from the shed in the back garden. Returning to my room, I knelt by the side of my bed, my gaze fixed on the section of floorboards where the sound seemed most pronounced. The wood was old and worn, the grain darkened with age and grime. Taking a deep breath, I wedged the end of the crowbar into the seam between two planks. The wood groaned in protest as I applied pressure. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to pry the boards upwards. Dust and splinters filled the air as the first board came loose. I moved to the next, and then the next, until I had created a small opening in the floor near my bed. I peered into the darkness beneath. The space was shallow, barely more than a cavity between the floorboards and the earth below. The air that rose from it was damp and carried a faint, earthy odor. My eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom. At first, I saw nothing but dirt and a few stray stones. Then I noticed them. Scattered across the underside of the floorboards and etched into the exposed earth of the cavity were marks. Scratches. Long, irregular gouges in the wood, as if something with sharp claws had been scraping at the underside of the floor. The marks in the earth were similar. Disturbed patches of soil that suggested something had been digging, trying to burrow its way upwards. The realization sent a shiver of icy terror down my spine. What had been beneath my floor? What had been making that dragging sound every night? And why had it been trying to claw its way out? I stared into the darkness, my mind racing, trying to comprehend the implications of my discovery. The cavity was small, too small for a person to fit inside, yet the scratch marks, they were undeniably there. A sudden scraping sound from directly beneath the remaining floorboards jolted me back to reality. It was the same sound I had been hearing every night, but now it was undeniably close, just inches beneath me. My blood ran cold. I scrambled back from the hole in the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. The scraping continued, more frantic now, accompanied by a faint, muffled scratching sound from within the cavity. The floorboards beneath my feet began to vibrate subtly. The scraping intensified, becoming more insistent, more desperate. I backed away slowly, my gaze fixed on the floor. The vibrations grew stronger. A thin line of dust began to rise from the seams between the remaining boards. Then, with a splintering crack, one of the floorboards near the hole buckled upwards. A dark, narrow shape began to emerge from the cavity, its form indistinct in the dim light. The scraping stopped. A low, rasping sound replaced it, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. I stood frozen, paralyzed by a terror beyond comprehension, as the shape continued to rise, slowly, inexorably, from the darkness beneath my floor. My days began before sunrise, the comforting aroma of yeast and flour filling my small bakery on a quiet street off Cheapside. A crucial element in my bread-making was the rainwater I collected in barrels placed on the rooftop. London's water supply could be unreliable and often tasted of the river, so the pure rainwater was essential for the quality of my dough. One morning, as I went to retrieve water for the day's baking, I noticed a peculiar discoloration in the barrels. The water, usually clear and fresh, had taken on a reddish hue. My initial thought was rust. The barrels were old, their iron hoops showing signs of age. Perhaps some rust had leached into the collected water overnight. Dismissing it as a minor inconvenience, I decided to proceed with my work. The color wasn't intensely red, more of a faint rusty tinge. I reasoned that it wouldn't significantly affect the dough, and the ovens would surely bake out any impurities. The morning progressed as usual, the shop filling with the comforting scent of baking bread. Customers arrived, eager for their daily loaves. By midday, however, complaints began to surface. Several patrons returned, their faces pale, clutching their stomachs. They spoke of a peculiar metallic taste to the bread and a general feeling of unwellness. What was more alarming was a detail they all mentioned. Their lips had acquired a strange crimson stain. I examined them myself, and indeed, a faint red hue marked their mouths. I was perplexed. I had used the same ingredients, the same methods. As always, concern gnawed at me. Could the discoloured rainwater be the cause? I tried to reassure the affected customers, offering them refunds and promising to investigate. As more and more people reported the same symptoms, my worry escalated into genuine alarm. Finally, I could ignore it no longer. After the last customer had left, I climbed the narrow stairs to the rooftop, my heart pounding with a growing sense of dread. The fog that often clung to the city was beginning to dissipate, revealing the row of rainwater barrels. I approached the first barrel, the one I had drawn from earlier. The water inside was undeniably red now, a deep, unsettling crimson. It was far beyond the discoloration caused by rust. A sickening realization began to dawn. I peered over the rim, my stomach churning. The water was murky, obscuring the bottom of the barrel. I leaned further, straining my eyes. Then I saw it. A shape submerged beneath the surface, a pale form wedged awkwardly within the confines of the barrel. My breath caught in my throat. With trembling hands, I reached for a long pole that I used for stirring the dough. I carefully pushed at the submerged shape. It shifted slightly, and a face, pale and lifeless, turned upwards. The eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. The throat was slashed, a dark, jagged wound marring the skin. The source of the red water was horrifyingly clear. A body. Someone had been murdered and stuffed into my rainwater barrel. The crimson stain on my customer's lips was not from rust. It was blood. A wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled back from the barrel, my mind reeling from the gruesome discovery. How had this happened? Who was the person in the barrel? And how many of my customers had consumed bread made with this tainted water? The image of their pale faces and crimson-stained lips flashed through my mind. A profound sense of horror and guilt overwhelmed me. I had unwittingly poisoned my customers. I stood on the rooftop, the fog swirling around me, the silent, accusing eyes of the corpse in the barrel seeming to follow my every move. The city stretched out below, oblivious to the horror I had just uncovered. The unsettling reality of what I had done, what I had unknowingly served to the people who trusted me, settled upon me with a crushing force. And the question of who the person was and how they ended up in my barrel remained unanswered, a chilling void in my understanding. Master Antoine Dubois had become a sensation in London. His wax museum on Fleet Street drew crowds from all walks of life, eager to marvel at his creations. His figures possessed an uncanny realism, capturing every nuance of human expression, from the serene countenance of sleeping cherubs to the tormented grimaces of historical villains. People whispered that he possessed a secret technique, a way of imbuing his wax with a lifelike quality that surpassed all other sculptors. One afternoon, a commotion erupted within the museum. A woman, elegantly dressed and clearly distraught, collapsed before one of the displays, her cries echoing through the hushed halls. She identified the figure as her missing husband, Lord Ashworth, who had vanished without a trace several weeks prior. The figure was posed standing, its waxen face frozen in an expression of utter terror, its eyes wide with a silent scream. News of the incident reached the constabulary swiftly. Given Lord Ashworth's prominent status, an immediate investigation was ordered. I was among the officers dispatched to Master Dubois's museum to ascertain the truth of the noble woman's claims. Upon our arrival, the museum was in disarray. Patrons had been cleared, and a palpable tension hung in the air. The noble woman, Lady Ashworth, stood trembling before the figure, her sobs still racking her body. Master Dubois, a man with nervous eyes and perpetually ink-stained fingers, stood nearby, his face a mask of bewildered innocence. He vehemently denied the accusation, insisting that all his figures were crafted solely from wax. We began our inspection. The figure of Lord Ashworth was indeed remarkably lifelike. The details were astonishing. The texture of his skin, the slight discoloration around the eyes, even the way his hair was styled. It was as if he were merely frozen in time. Skepticism filled the ranks of my fellow constables. How could wax so perfectly replicate a human form? Yet the resemblance to the missing lord was undeniable. Lady Ashworth provided intricate details of a scar on his hand, a small mole on his neck, features that were all present on the waxen figure. The magistrate who had accompanied us ordered a more thorough examination. With trepidation, we carefully moved the figure to a secluded room within the museum. Under the harsh glare of our lanterns, we began to probe the surface of the wax. The wax was surprisingly hard, yet brittle in places. As we worked, a faint, unpleasant odor began to permeate the air, a smell that was vaguely familiar, yet deeply unsettling. It was not the scent of beeswax. Following the magistrate's instructions, we carefully chipped away a small section of the wax on the figure's arm. What we found beneath sent a wave of horror through us. It was not more wax. It was skin, human skin, preserved and carefully fitted beneath the outer layer of wax. A gasp escaped Lady Ashworth's lips as the gruesome truth began to dawn. We continued our examination, our initial skepticism replaced by a growing sense of dread. Each figure we inspected yielded the same horrifying discovery. Beneath the meticulously sculpted wax lay preserved human remains. The figure identified as Lord Ashworth contained his actual bones, his actual flesh, his actual hair. His clothes were his own. The terror etched upon the waxen face was merely a reflection of the horror that must have gripped him in his final moments. And then we noticed something else. On each of the figures, the mouths were sewn shut with fine, almost invisible stitches. A detail so subtle, so macabre, that it sent a chill to the very core of our beings. The museum became a scene of grim investigation. Each display, once admired for its artistry, was now viewed with revulsion and dread. We worked for hours, carefully examining each of Master Dubois' creations. The sheer scale of his horrific undertaking was staggering. Dozens of figures, each one a silent testament to a life brutally ended and grotesquely preserved. The question that haunted us was, who were these people? And how had Master Dubois acquired their remains? There were no signs of forced entry to the museum, no indication of struggles. We searched Master Dubois's living quarters, located above the museum. The rooms were meticulously clean, almost sterile. We found no obvious tools of murder, no signs of foul play. Yet the sheer number of preserved bodies suggested a campaign of violence on a scale that was difficult to comprehend. Master Dubois remained impassive throughout the investigation, his initial denials giving way to a chilling silence. He offered no explanation, no remorse, just a vacant stare that offered no insight into the darkness that resided within him. As the investigation drew to a close, with the horrifying truth laid bare, a new discovery was made. In a hidden alcove behind the display of historical figures, we found a new sculpture, still unfinished. It was a figure of a young woman, her features delicate and serene. But it was the inscription carved into the base that sent a final, chilling wave of dread through me. It was my sister's name. She had been missing for several weeks. The waxen face bore a striking resemblance. The mouth was not yet sewn shut. My business, a modest printing press nestled in the bustling district near St. Paul's, relied heavily on the swift delivery of documents and proofs. One Tuesday morning I dispatched young Thomas with a package destined for a rather obscure address. Num 17 Nightingale Lane, a small street I believed to be tucked away near Covent Garden. Thomas was reliable, if not particularly bright, and the journey should have taken no more than an hour or two, but Thomas did not return. As the day wore on, my initial concern morphed into a gnawing worry. By nightfall, with no sign of him, frustration began to boil within me. The package contained important legal papers, and their timely delivery was crucial. The following morning, resolving to take matters into my own hands, I consulted my map of London. Nightingale Lane was clearly marked, situated in a warren of smaller streets just north of Covent Garden Market. I set out confident that a personal visit would quickly resolve the matter. Upon reaching the vicinity indicated on the map, I found myself in a state of utter bewilderment. The streets and buildings simply did not align with the cartographer's depiction. Where Nightingale Lane should have been, there stood a row of substantial townhouses, their facades imposing, and their numbering completely different. I checked my map again, then the street signs, a knot of confusion tightening in my stomach. Perhaps I had misread the map, I inquired with a street vendor selling roasted nuts, asking for directions to Nightingale Lane. The man looked at me blankly, his brow furrowed in confusion. He'd been working in this area for years, he claimed, and had never encountered such a street. I asked another, a coachman waiting for a fare. He too shook his head, his expression suggesting I was either mistaken or perhaps even jesting. My frustration mounted. It was as if the street had vanished from the very fabric of the city. Returning to my shop, I spoke to my other employees, asking if any of them were familiar with Nightingale Lane. Old Mr. Hemlock, who had worked for me for decades and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of London's intricate network of streets, paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. He recalled a Nightingale Lane, a narrow, cobbled passage with a few modest dwellings, located precisely where my map indicated. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a fresh wave of bewilderment. If Mr. Hemlock remembered it, why could I not find it? And why were the locals so insistent that no such street existed? The following day, Mr. Hemlock did not arrive for work. This was unusual. He was a creature of habit, his punctuality legendary. I sent a boy to his lodgings to inquire. The boy returned with unsettling news. Mr. Hemlock's landlady claimed he had left early that morning, carrying a small bag, and had not said where he was going. This was unlike him. A few days later, I spoke to a former apprentice, now working at a print shop near the Strand. I mentioned my difficulty in locating Nightingale Lane. His eyes widened in recognition. He too remembered the street, a place he had occasionally delivered proofs 2 years ago. The next week, I learned that the former apprentice had also disappeared. His employer was perplexed. He had simply not turned up for work one morning, leaving his belongings behind. No one had seen him since. A creeping dread began to consume me. It was as if the city itself was actively forgetting Nightingale Lane, and those who retained the memory were being erased. I tried to speak of it to others, to friends and acquaintances, but their reactions ranged from polite disbelief to outright dismissal. They had never known of a Nightingale Lane near Covent Garden. My memories, once shared, now felt isolated, fragile. I consulted other maps, older editions, hoping to find some corroboration of Nightingale Lane's existence. Some showed it, others did not. It was as if the street existed in a fleeting, uncertain state, visible to some, invisible to others. I revisited the location multiple times, each visit deepening my unease. The buildings remained the same, their addresses stubbornly refusing to match the numbering I had for number 17 Nightingale Lane. The more I tried to reconcile my memory with the present reality, the more disoriented I became. It was as if a piece of London had been excised, leaving a phantom limb of memory that only a few could still feel. One evening, as dusk settled over the city, I found myself drawn back to the area. A peculiar compulsion urged me to search once more. The gas lamps flickered, their light creating dancing patterns on the cobblestones. I walked slowly, my gaze sweeping over the familiar yet alien facades of the buildings. Then, for a fleeting moment, as the light shifted, I thought I perceived it. A narrow opening between two of the townhouses, an alleyway that seemed to materialize from the gloom. It was just a glimpse, a fleeting impression, but for a second I could almost see the faint outline of a street sign, N-G-A-L. I blinked, and it was gone. The two townhouses stood solid and unyielding, with no gap between them. Had it been a trick of the light, a figment of my increasingly troubled imagination? I stood there for a long time, staring at the brickwork, a profound sense of unease settling over me. The air felt colder in that particular spot, a subtle chill that had nothing to do with the autumn evening. As I finally turned to leave, a familiar figure emerged from the swirling fog at the corner of the street. It was Thomas, my missing courier. He looked different, pale, gaunt, his eyes wide and vacant. He was carrying the package he had been tasked to deliver weeks ago. He walked past me without any sign of recognition, his footsteps making no sound on the cobblestones. He turned down the street towards the very spot where I'd glimpsed the phantom alleyway. I called out his name, but he did not respond. He continued walking, his figure receding into the fog until he disappeared completely. I stood there, rooted to the spot, a cold terror gripping my heart. What had happened to Thomas? Where had he been? And what was Nightingale Lane? I looked back at the two townhouses. For a moment I could almost hear a faint sound emanating from the brickwork. A whisper carried on the night air, a sound like the rustling of pages in a forgotten book. Then everything was silent once more. The street remained the same, solid and indifferent, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that Nightingale Lane was still there, just out of sight, waiting, and perhaps it was waiting for me too. The lanes of London had become quieter than usual. A disquiet settled over the cobblestones, a subtle shift in the city's familiar cacophony. Children were vanishing, not one or two, but a steady trickle, each disappearance leaving behind distraught families and unanswered questions. The only common thread linking the lost children was the location where they were last seen, a narrow, twisting alleyway that branched off Fleet Street, a dark crevice between two tall buildings. The alley was unremarkable, just another shadowed passage in the city's labyrinthine network. Yet it had acquired a sinister reputation. Parents warned their children to avoid it, and even the bravest of the local lads gave it a wide berth after dusk. A constable, a young man named Davies, known for his diligence, was assigned to investigate the disappearances. He interviewed witnesses, questioned families, and spent days patrolling the vicinity of the alley. One evening he was seen entering the narrow passage. He did not emerge. His disappearance only amplified the fear that gripped the community. The alley became a place spoken of only in hushed tones, a silent testament to the unknown horrors that might lurk within the city's hidden corners. Years passed. The disappearances eventually ceased, though the fate of the missing children and Constable Davies remained a grim mystery. The tenement building that bordered one side of the alley was eventually abandoned, its windows boarded up, its structure slowly succumbing to the ravages of time and neglect. Decades later, I found myself part of a construction crew tasked with demolishing the old tenement. The building was dilapidated, its foundations weakened, deemed unsafe for habitation. As we began the work, tearing down walls and clearing debris, we noticed an anomaly. Beneath what was once the ground floor, we discovered a section of brickwork that appeared newer than the rest of the foundation. It was a wall, seemingly built to seal off a portion of the undercroft. Curiosity piqued, we set about dismantling the wall. The bricks were mortared tightly, and it took several hours of strenuous labor to create an opening. The space beyond was dark and confined, the air within stale and musty. As we shone our lanterns into the enclosed area, a collective gasp escaped our lips. The chamber was small, barely large enough to accommodate a few people, and within it, scattered across the earthen floor, were bones, dozens of them. Tiny bones, fragile and white, clearly those of children. A profound silence descended upon us, broken only by the frantic beating of our own hearts. The grim reality of the disappearances from years ago settled upon us with crushing force. This was where they had ended up, these lost children, hidden away beneath the forgotten tenement. Amidst the scattered remains, we discovered something else, a pile of decayed fabric, the remnants of clothing. As we carefully sifted through the tattered material, we unearthed a tarnished buckle bearing the insignia of the London Constabulary. It was Constable Davies's buckle. A cold dread washed over me. The young constable who had sought to uncover the truth had met the same fate as the children he tried to save. He had entered the alley and vanished, only to be found years later, entombed with his quarry in this secret chamber beneath the earth. The air in the chamber felt heavy, stagnant. A sense of profound sorrow and a chilling unease permeated the space. We continued to examine the contents, our lanterns casting long, dancing figures on the damp brick walls. Then I noticed something near the far corner of the chamber. Partially buried beneath a pile of bones was a small wooden toy. It was a carved horse, its paint faded and chipped but still recognizable. As I reached down to pick it up, my fingers brushed against something else. Something cold and smooth. I carefully cleared away the surrounding bones and dust. What I uncovered sent a fresh wave of icy terror through me. It was another bone, larger than the others, and attached to it, by a piece of dried sinew, was a small tarnished key. The key was old, its teeth intricately cut. What lock did it open? What other secrets lay hidden within this chamber, or perhaps somewhere else beneath the city? A sudden sound from the alleyway above made me jump. It was a faint scratching, a sound that seemed to echo the scraping noises one might expect from small bones being moved. I exchanged terrified glances with my fellow workers. The sound came again, a little louder this time, as if something was shifting in the narrow passage above us. We extinguished our lanterns, plunging the chamber into darkness. The scratching continued, accompanied now by a soft, almost imperceptible pattering sound like tiny feet on stone. The sounds grew fainter, receding into the distance, towards the alley's entrance. A chilling realization dawned upon me. Whatever had taken the children, whatever had taken Constable Davies, might still be out there, somewhere in the labyrinthine streets of London, and perhaps it was even now returning to its lair beneath the abandoned tenement. The lodging house on Old Street had always been a place of transience, its rooms filled with a rotating affordable shelter within the sprawling city. Its low rates were its primary draw, for the building itself possessed a certain air of neglect, a subtle decay that seemed to seep from. It wasn't long before whispers began to circulate among the tenants, tales of unsettling occurrences within its aged walls. Some spoke of waking in the dead of night with a crushing sensation of an unseen hand were pressing down, stealing their breath. They would lie paralyzed, unable to cry out, their bodies locked in a terrifying stillness until the invisible pressure finally lifted, leaving them gasping. Others recounted a pervasive feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation on their skin as they moved through the dimly lit hallways or lay in their beds. They would turn suddenly, convinced of another presence, and find themselves alone, the silence amplifying their disquiet. I myself experienced these phenomena. There were nights when I would awaken to find myself completely immobile, a profound sense of dread washed the darkness, certain that unseen eyes were fixed upon me from the corners of the room. The feeling was icy, invasive, leaving me shaken and exhausted even after a night of apparent rest. A man named Mr. Ainsworth dismissed these complaints as the overactive imaginations of weary travellers and stressed city dwellers. He attributed the strange occurrences to drafts settling general ambience of an old building. Yet the stories persisted, shared in hushed tones in the common areas, fostering an atmosphere of perpetual apprehension among the residents. Eventually, Mr. Ainsworth, perhaps finally complaints or simply seeking to improve the property's appeal, decided to undertake some renovations. A section of wall in the main hallway, which had always appeared somewhat bowed and unsound. The day the workmen arrived, a strange anticipation hung in the air. The tenants gathered in the hallway, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as the labourers began to dismantle the old wall. Brick, they chipped away at the aged mortar, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the grimy windows. As the wall began to crumble, an unusual odour permeated the air, a scent unlike anything I had encountered before. It grew stronger as the workmen progressed, causing some of the tenants to wrinkle their noses in distaste. Then, as the final layer of bricks was removed, a collective gasp filled the hallway. Bricked up within the wall cavity, standing upright and facing outwards, was a figure. It was mummified, its skin stretched taut and leathery over its bones. Its eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead, and its mouth was agape in a silent, eternal scream. The figure was dressed in what appeared to be remnants of clothing from a bygone era, the fabric brittle and faded. A hush fell over the onlookers, the initial shock giving way to a profound sense of horror. The workmen recoiled, their tools clattering to the floor. Mr. Ainsworth stood frozen, his face ashen, his earlier dismissiveness utterly shattered. The mummified figure remained there, a silent testament to some long-forgotten tragedy within the walls of the lodging house. Its presence explained the pervasive feeling of unease, the nighttime paralysis, the sensation of being watched. It was a tangible manifestation of the eerie presence that had plagued the tenants for so long. The constables were summoned, and the lodging house became a scene of grim investigation. The mummified figure was carefully removed from the wall, its brittle form handled with the utmost caution. Questions abounded, but answers were scarce. Who was this person? How had they come to be entombed within the wall? And why that silent scream? The other walls were examined, tapped and probed, but no further hidden chambers or remains were discovered. The mummified figure became the focus of intense scrutiny, but its identity remained elusive. The clothing offered few clues, and the state of preservation made detailed examination difficult. The lodging house, once a haven for those seeking cheap lodgings, became a place of notoriety. Some tenants moved out immediately, unable to bear the thought of sleeping in a building that concealed such a gruesome secret. Others remained, drawn by a morbid curiosity and the unsettling feeling that the mystery of the mummified figure was somehow intertwined with their own experiences within those walls. I stayed. Perhaps it was a foolish decision, but I felt compelled to understand the source of the terror that had gripped this place. Now, as night falls and the old house settles into its familiar creaks and groans, I find myself staring at the section of wall where the figure was discovered. The bricks have been replaced, the hallway repaired, but the chilling presence remains. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I fancy I can still perceive that silent scream echoing through the empty corridors, a haunting reminder of the secrets buried within the walls, secrets that may never be fully unearthed. My life was one of routine, a nightly pilgrimage through the gaslit streets of London. With my long pole and flickering flame, I brought illumination to the darkened corners of the city, pushing back the gloom that descended after twilight. Night after night, the same streets, the same lamps, the same dance of light and shade. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. One evening, as I ignited a lamp on a particularly narrow lane off Fleet Street, I noticed something peculiar about my own form stretched out on the cobblestones before me. It was longer than it ought to be, elongated in a manner that the angle of the lamplight did not entirely explain. I adjusted my position, but the distortion remained. It was as if my shadow possessed a strange elasticity. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, the uneven surface of the street playing games with my perception, but over subsequent nights the anomaly persisted. My shadow would stretch and contort in ways that defied the laws of optics, its edges sometimes blurring, sometimes sharp and distinct, yet always possessing an unnatural length. What was more unsettling was the sense that it possessed a degree of autonomy. While my own form moved in tandem with my steps, my shadow occasionally seemed to possess a will of its own. It might extend further than my reach as I raised my lamp, or it might sway gently even when I stood perfectly still. These instances were fleeting, subtle, but they planted a seed of disquiet within me. As time passed, the shadow's independence became more pronounced. Its shape began to deviate from my own. The head, once a simple oval mirroring mind, seemed to elongate, developing a sharper, more angular profile. The shoulders appeared broader, the limbs thinner and more spindly. It was becoming a distorted caricature of my own form, a dark reflection that was slowly evolving into something else entirely. A profound sense of isolation began to grip me. I dared not speak of this to anyone. Who would believe such a tale? I imagined the ridicule, the concerned glances, the whispers behind my back, so I kept my observations to myself, a growing knot of apprehension tightening in my chest with each passing night. The streets, once familiar and comforting in their predictable darkness punctuated by my lamplight, now felt alien and menacing. Every flicker of the flame, every gust of wind that rustled through the narrow passages seemed to animate my shadow, fueling its strange transformation. I found myself avoiding looking at it directly, my gaze fixed on the lamps I was lighting, yet always aware of the dark mimic that trailed behind me, growing ever more distinct. One particularly moonless night, as I made my rounds through the labyrinthine alleys near the docks, the change became undeniable. My shadow, stretched out long and gaunt on the damp cobblestones, possessed a form entirely its own. It was taller than me, its limbs elongated and skeletal, its head a sharp, pointed silhouette. Then it happened. As I paused beneath a flickering lamp, my shadow moved. Not in unison with my own step, but independently. It stretched out further, its elongated hand seeming to grasp at the wall beside it. A cold dread washed over me. I took a step forward, and my shadow remained still. It was no longer an extension of myself, it was separate. Terror seized me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my ears. The shadow remained on the ground, its form solid and distinct. Then it began to glide along the cobblestones, not towards me but away, towards the dark moor of a narrow alleyway. I watched, paralyzed by fear, as my shadow, my own dark reflection, detached itself completely and disappeared into the inky blackness of the alley. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the lamplight casting my own form on the ground, a solitary figure now devoid of its counterpart. A profound sense of emptiness washed over me, a chilling premonition of something terrible to come. The rest of my rounds that night were a blur of fear and confusion. I hurried through the streets, my gaze constantly darting to the ground, expecting to see the detached shadow lurking in some darkened corner, but it was gone. The next morning I was found slumped against a lamppost on a quiet street near the river. My lamp lay extinguished beside me. My body cast no shadow at all. The sun rose higher in the sky, illuminating the cobblestones where my dark reflection should have been, leaving only the stark reality of my lifeless form. My master, Dr. Silas Blackwood, enjoyed a renown that stretched far beyond the confines of our London practice. His skill with the knife was unparalleled, his understanding of anatomy revolutionary. Students flocked from across the continent to learn from him, and even the Royal Society held his opinions in high regard. Yet, despite the accolades, a disquieting murmur ran beneath the surface of his celebrated career. Whispers, like shadows in a dimly lit operating theatre, spoke of the singular ease with which Dr. Blackwood procured fresh cadavers for his anatomical studies. In a time when grave robbing was rampant and bodies were difficult to obtain legally, his supply seemed inexhaustible, almost preternatural. As his apprentice, I witnessed this firsthand. While other surgeons lamented the scarcity of subjects, Dr. Blackwood always had what he needed, delivered to his private dissecting room with an efficiency that bordered on the uncanny. Questions arose in my mind, unwelcome and persistent, like a recurring phantom pain. Where did these bodies come from? How did he acquire them with such regularity? The official explanations, donations from the destitute, unclaimed remains from the workhouse, never quite satisfied the gnawing feeling in my gut. One particularly unsettling incident solidified my growing suspicion. A young woman, known to me by sight from the local market, succumbed to a swift illness. I attended her burial, a sombre affair with few mourners. Yet within the week, a cadaver matching her description, down to a peculiar birthmark on her arm, appeared in our dissecting room. Dr. Blackwood offered a curt explanation about a late donation. But the coincidence felt too stark, too improbable. The unease festered within me, a knot of dread tightening with each passing day. I began to observe my master more closely, noting his late-night excursions, the cloaked figures who occasionally visited his residence under the cover of darkness, the faint, sweetish odour that sometimes emanated from the locked room at the end of the hall. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a growing sense of dread, I resolved to uncover the truth. One evening, after Dr. Blackwood had retired to his study, I feigned illness and excused myself. Instead of going to my own meagre room, I waited in the shadows of the hallway, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Hours passed. The house settled into an unnerving silence, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards. Then, just as the grandfather clock in the hall chimed the hour of midnight, I perceived a faint light emanating from beneath the door of the locked room. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was where the answers lay. Moving with extreme caution, I crept towards the door. The lock was old and simple. With trembling fingers, I produced a set of lockpicks I had acquired some time ago. The tumblers clicked softly, one by one. The door creaked open just enough for me to slip inside. The air within the room was cold, stagnant, and carried a peculiar scent, a cloying mixture of embalming fluids and something else, something vaguely metallic and sickeningly sweet. My eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light cast by several flickering candles placed around the room. What I beheld within those walls sent a wave of nausea and terror crashing over me. The room was not a storage chamber, as I had imagined. It was a macabre display, a grotesque tableau of preserved human bodies. They were not laid out on slabs ready for dissection. Instead, they were arranged in lifelike poses, as if frozen in the midst of everyday activities. A woman sat at a table, her preserved hand clutching a porcelain teacup, her vacant eyes staring blankly ahead. A man stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the darkened street outside, his skin stretched taut over his skull. Another figure lay on a chaise lounge, a book open in their lap, their features contorted in a silent scream. The artistry was disturbing, meticulous. Each body had been carefully preserved, their limbs positioned with an unsettling attention to detail. But it was not the arrangement alone that chilled me to the bone. It was the realization that some of these bodies were recent. The skin on several of the figures retained a semblance of color, not the pallid hue of someone long deceased. Their hair still possessed a certain sheen. One figure, a young boy seated on a small stool, even had a faint flush on his cheeks. It was as if they had only just ceased to be. My mind reeled. How could this be? These individuals should have been buried, their earthly remains returned to the soil. Yet here they were, preserved and posed in this secret chamber, their silent stories frozen in time. As I moved further into the room, my gaze fell upon a figure lying on a large, ornate bed in the corner. It was a young woman, her features delicate and familiar. My blood ran cold. I recognized her. It was the market girl, the one who had supposedly been buried just days ago. Her eyes were closed, her expression serene, almost peaceful. But as I drew closer, I noticed something else. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor seemed to run through her preserved hand, which rested on the coverlet. I stared, unblinking, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it my imagination, the flickering candlelight playing tricks on my eyes? Then it happened again. A slight twitch of her fingers. A low moan, barely audible, seemed to escape her lips. My mind screamed in disbelief and terror. This was not possible. The dead do not... Her eyelids fluttered. I stood frozen, paralyzed by a horror beyond comprehension, as the young woman on the bed slowly, agonizingly began to open her eyes. Our master Elias Thorne was once the most celebrated watchmaker in all of London. His shop on Lombard Street was a testament to precision and artistry, its windows displaying intricate mechanisms that captivated passers-by. Patrons from the highest echelons of society sought his creations, each timepiece a marvel of engineering and aesthetic beauty. Then came the obsession. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as a quiet preoccupation with the nature of time itself. Master Thorne started poring over ancient texts, delving into arcane philosophies, his focus shifting from the mere measurement of hours to the very essence of temporal existence. He became consumed by the notion of time's ultimate destination, its inevitable conclusion, death. Whispers began to circulate, initially among his clientele, then spreading like wildfire through the city. Master Thorne was attempting to build a timepiece capable of predicting the moment of demise. At first it was dismissed as the eccentricity of a brilliant mind. But then the predictions began. A wealthy merchant known for his robust health purchased one of Master Thorne's peculiar new creations. The watch, crafted from polished ebony and inlaid with silver skulls, bore an inscription on its inner casing: "Your final hour approaches." Within days the merchant succumbed to a sudden and inexplicable illness. Another followed, a renowned actress who scoffed at the notion, only to perish in a tragic accident precisely when her timepiece indicated. Fear, sharp and cold, began to grip London. The once coveted watches became objects of terror, yet a morbid curiosity also fueled their demand. People, it seemed, were both repelled and fascinated by the prospect of knowing their end. The constabulary could no longer ignore the growing panic. Superstition and fear were breeding unrest. I, Constable Davies, was assigned to investigate the unsettling events surrounding Master Thorne and his macabre creations. My inquiries led me to Lombard Street. The once bustling shop of Master Thorne was now shrouded in an eerie silence. The windows were dusty, the displays still, as if time itself had ceased within. The door was unlocked. I entered cautiously, the scent of aged wood and metal filling the air. The interior was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the grimy windows. Dust motes danced in the faint light, creating an almost spectral atmosphere. The shop appeared deserted. Timepieces of all shapes and sizes lay scattered on workbenches, their intricate gears frozen in mid-rotation. It was as if their creator had simply vanished. I proceeded further into the shop, towards the back room, where Master Thorne was known to work on his most intricate projects. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The sight that greeted me was one I shall never forget. Master Thorne sat slumped over his workbench, his head resting on a partially completed clock. His body was still, lifeless. A closer inspection revealed no signs of struggle. He appeared to have simply stopped. His face was pale, his eyes closed, a faint, almost serene expression on his features. On the workbench before him lay his final creation. It was unlike any of the others I had seen. This timepiece was crafted from gleaming silver, its design intricate and unsettlingly beautiful. Instead of Roman numerals, the hours were marked by tiny, intricately carved tombstones. My attention was drawn to the inner casing, which lay open. Carved into the polished metal were two words: Constable Davies. A chill ran down my spine, my own name. My gaze then fell upon the watch face. The hands were stopped. Precisely. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. The stopped hands pointed to a time that was now. The landlord of the boarding house on Threadneedle Street possessed a peculiar boast. He declared with a wide, unsettling grin that his establishment had never once experienced a true vacancy. Every room, he claimed, was always occupied, yet a disquieting pattern had emerged, a series of unexplained departures that contradicted his pronouncements. Tenants would arrive, settle into their rooms, and then, without warning or explanation, vanish. Their rent might be paid up, their belongings left untouched. A half-written letter might lie on a desk, a plate of food sit congealing on a bedside table, a coat hang neatly on a hook. It was as if the occupants had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the lingering echoes of their recent presence. Rumours circulated amongst the remaining lodgers, whispers of an odd stillness that would sometimes descend upon the house, a silence deeper than the usual nighttime quiet. Some spoke of a chill that permeated certain rooms, a coldness that had no discernible source. Others recounted fleeting glimpses of something indistinct at the periphery of their vision, a fleeting impression that vanished as soon as they turned their gaze directly towards it. The local magistrate, troubled by the increasing number of reports of missing persons linked to the boarding house, dispatched me to investigate. My task was to ascertain the truth behind the disappearances and determine if any foul play was involved. Upon my arrival, the landlord, a man named Silas Grimshaw, greeted me with an overly jovial demeanour that did little to mask the unsettling glint in his eyes. He reiterated his claim of perpetual occupancy, his smile never quite reaching his gaze. He granted me access to the rooms of the missing tenants, his eagerness bordering on the suspicious. The rooms were as described. In one, a book lay open on a chair, a bookmark inserted halfway through. In another, a shaving brush rested beside a half-lathered bowl. The personal effects scattered throughout each room spoke of lives abruptly interrupted, of departures that were neither planned nor voluntary. I examined each room meticulously, searching for any sign of struggle, any clue that might shed light on the disappearances. There were no signs of forced entry, no indications of violence. The only anomaly was the pervasive stillness, an almost expectant silence that seemed to hang in the very fabric of the building. In one of the rooms on the upper floor, belonging to a man who had vanished some weeks prior, I noticed something unusual. A large wardrobe stood against one wall, its back flush against the panelling. However, upon closer inspection, I detected a subtle difference in the texture of the wall behind it, a barely perceptible seam that suggested a break in the plasterwork. Curiosity piqued, I attempted to move the wardrobe. It was surprisingly light, as if its contents had also vanished along with its owner. With a slight effort, I pulled it away from the wall, revealing a narrow rectangular outline. It was a door, concealed behind the wardrobe, its presence deliberately hidden. The door was made of dark wood, its surface smooth and unadorned. There was no handle, no hinges visible on this side. It appeared to be a seamless part of the wall, designed to remain unnoticed. I ran my fingers along the edges, searching for a latch or some means of opening it. After a moment, my fingers brushed against a small indentation near the top, a subtle catch that had been cleverly disguised. With a surge of anticipation and a growing sense of dread, I pressed the catch. A soft click echoed from within the wall, and a section of the panelling swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. The air that emanated from within was stale and cold, carrying a faint, earthy odour. I peered into the darkness, but could see nothing beyond a short, unlit passage. Hesitantly, I stepped through the opening, my senses on high alert. The passage was just wide enough for one person, the walls smooth and cold to the touch. I took another step and then another, venturing deeper into the unknown space hidden within the boarding house. The darkness enveloped me completely. I reached out my hands, trying to orient myself, but encountered only the smooth, unyielding surfaces of the walls. The air grew colder and the faint, earthy odour intensified. I continued forward, my footsteps making no sound on the unseen floor. The passage seemed to descend slightly, and I could sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a feeling of anticipation. Then the passage opened into a larger space. I could sense the change in the air, the increased volume of the unseen room. I reached into my coat pocket for my tinderbox, intending to light a small flame to illuminate my surroundings. But before I could strike the flint, I perceived something in the darkness ahead, a faint luminescence, a soft, ethereal glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. I moved towards the light, my curiosity overcoming my apprehension. As I drew nearer, the glow intensified, revealing the outlines of the space around me. The room was circular, its walls lined with shelves, and on those shelves were rows upon rows of objects that glinted faintly in the ethereal light. I took another step, and the light grew brighter, revealing the nature of the objects on the shelves. They were personal belongings: coats, hats, books, letters, half-eaten plates of food, the possessions of the missing tenants. And then I saw them, standing silently in the center of the room. Figures, still and upright. As the light illuminated their forms more fully, I recognized them. They were the missing tenants, each one standing as if frozen in time, their expressions blank, their eyes wide and vacant. I took another step forward, my breath catching in my throat. One of the figures turned its head, its eyes fixed upon me. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound escaped my lips. The figure began to move, and then everything went dark.